So a lot of times in that sales process, when you're trying to sell your zone of genius, sometimes it can feel weird, especially if your zone of genius is not something the everyday person is looking for. And that's good. And you talk about that, right? Like niching down, find your perfect person. But if you don't tip the scale, like if you have a scale in front of you and one side is money for the client and the other side is the pain pleasure factor, like you've got to tip that scale to where money doesn't matter anymore to them. And especially if you're charging high ticket and you want to be making what you deserve in your zone of genius, because we all deserve to be making exactly what we want for that level of genius we have. So if you're not tipping the scale for them, it's going to be really hard for them to understand why they need it.
Welcome to Building Your $1 Million Brand. I'm your host, Kira Giglu, messaging and marketing expert, conversion copywriter, and CEO of The Copy Atelier. I'm on a mission to help female entrepreneurs build $1 million brands. So if that's you, you're in the right place. Join me for the best tips, strategies, and stories from the expert trailblazers, change makers, and entrepreneurs who are building their $1 million brands their own way. This is Building Your $1 Million Brand podcast. Let's get to work. Hello, friends. How are you doing today? Welcome back to another episode of the Building Your $1 Million Brand podcast. I'm really excited to have you here, and especially today because we have a really special guest, our first interviewee since the podcast rebranded. Today, I'm chatting with former client turned friend and business confidence, so it's the best kind, Melody. Mel is a business strategist who has spent over a decade working with some of the biggest names in the business, education, and wellness industries, helping them develop their programs, increase their sales, and optimize their client and customer experiences. She's used to working with multi-million-dollar companies and brands, so trust me when I say that she knows what she's talking about when it comes to creating $1 million offers. And I'm so excited to be chatting with her today. She has so much goodness to share with you, so let's get going. Hi, Mel. Yay. Welcome to the Building Your $1 Million Brand podcast. I'm so glad to have you here.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I'm super excited to be here.
So am I. We've spoken about doing this for months and it's finally happening. So I'm really excited. So let's get started by, why don't you give us your bio, tell everyone how you came to be where you are today.
Yeah, so I will make a very long story short. I have been doing this, like she said, for like about 10 years. I started out just basically on corporate teams, working in the background, kind of behind the curtains of these really big names that we see on social media and places like that they seem like the experts, right? But they do have a team behind them, actually kind of hiding behind the curtain on stage, right? Helping them design everything and bring that stuff to the public and the masses. And I'm usually behind the scenes on those things. So I'm one of those people peering out behind the curtain, just helping people optimize their offers, optimize their clients' zone of incompetence and their own zone of genius, which we can definitely talk more about. But that's ultimately what I do. And it's all about building that framework and selling those offers at a higher level.
Amazing. Yeah. And I love what you do and the fact that you've always pointed out that these huge people have teams behind them. And sometimes it's strange because it's almost like there's this way of making it seem as if there isn't a team behind them and it's just them doing everything. And of course it's not. And you're obviously such an integral part to that. So I want to dive into, first of all, this idea of zone of genius, because a lot of listeners will have heard this term. I was familiar with it, but not as familiar with it as I came to be after you explained it to me properly one time. So why don't you tell us exactly what a zone of genius is? What does that mean?
Yeah, so I'll put it into some context as well. So a zone of genius is ultimately that one thing that you, and potentially not even just one thing, but it's these things that we have that we're either born with or have developed over years from a number of different things. But it's a skill set that you have that nobody else can do just like you. So when you have that ability, you would be speaking to somebody who that's their zone of incompetence. And there's essentially 4 zones. There's zone of genius, zone of excellence, which means like you're highly skilled and not people are as skilled, but maybe there are some people that do it better. Zone of incompetence, which means you're not good at that. And many people do it better. And you usually hire people to do it for you when you're in that zone. And then zone of competence is really just you're very average at it. So when you have those 4 zones, we want to make sure that your zone of genius, the thing that you do that's exceptional and no one does like you, is speaking directly to the person who it's their zone of incompetence or just zone of competence, so that they go, oh, I need to hire that person where that's their genius. Does that make sense?
It does, yeah. So it's almost like matching up the thing that they're lacking with what it is that you do best.
Yes.
So I really like that.
The other thing to mention that sometimes people are like, well, what if I work really hard at something all my life? Does it become a genius? That's like a really interesting perspective on this. And a lot of times I personally say no, because the thing is you could learn a skill, but every single person is going to utilize that skill with their own personal identity. So in my opinion, the zone of genius isn't something that you can, like, nobody can copy you, right? Like that's never something someone can copy you on, because it's yours and you own it. And you're bringing your unique viewpoint and realities and experience to that skill set.
Yeah, exactly. And I really love that, because obviously what we're talking about today, like selling your zone of genius, and we've spoken about this in the past. So yeah, if I haven't mentioned, I've mentioned Mel quite a few times. Maybe you don't listen to the podcast, so you won't have heard me, but I've mentioned you quite a few times on here. So people might have heard of her, because Mel was a client of mine. We met almost a year ago. Time flies. And Mel became a client, and we worked together to develop, a lot of her brand messaging and those kinds of things. And obviously we became friends. We have a lot of common, like we're very similar personalities, and it's great. And one of the things that we've always spoken about so much is that what Mel does in her area of expertise aligns so nicely with my area of expertise, because it's, the foundations of your brand is, those messaging aspects and everything that we speak about here. But when it comes to selling your offers and being able to create the kind of marketing and messaging and copy and promote and sell those offers effectively, how those offers are actually built and what they're made up of is obviously a vital part to that. So we've always spoken about how what we do goes hand in hand. And that's why I love this idea, because really with your zone of genius, that's, exactly, it's being able to hit on the USP of your offer. And I always like to think that, your USP, your unique selling point, or your unique value proposition, your UVP, unique because nobody else can do it like you. And as soon as you realize that, the space for where you feel like, oh, there's other people in my niche who are doing the same thing, there's other people in my niche, period, and you allow those thoughts to make you think that you'll never be successful because there's other people out there who do the same thing as you, but it's just not true. Because if you're working in your zone of genius, if your offer is coming from there, and then you're able to extract that out and put that across in your messaging, you will always be positioning yourself as entirely unique and perfect for that specific ideal client.
Exactly.
And I love it. So when it comes to creating and selling your offers, why do you think this idea of the zone of genius matters so much? Like, how does that come into play with actually creating and selling an offer?
Yeah, such a good question, because it's really double-sided. So, you definitely have the piece where you need to understand yourself from like this very deep level, right? And I do believe that a lot of trouble that entrepreneurs have is they automatically assume they need to create their entire business just solely around the buyer, which that's actually true in the way that you build it, but you don't want to create the entire business for them until you understand yourself from a deeper level. So that's where that zone of genius comes in, because sometimes we get caught up in trends or what's popular. And a lot of times, maybe that's not exactly your zone of genius. So you might be forcing something. So one of the very first steps that we take with these larger personalities that I work with sometimes is we do try to make sure and identify, all the areas of their zone of genius, the reason they're here, the reason that they're doing this. And then we create those offers around the direct zone of incompetence that genius is talking to. So really that total polar opposite, the person that is literally lacking that. And we create that offer and the framework and the experience for that person, even though it is being created by the person who has that as their genius.
Yeah, I love that. I really love the fact that it's just when you say it like this, and I told you before when you said it like this, when you did a guest masterclass in BMME, which is our group program, and just that idea of matching up your zone of genius with their zone of incompetence, and essentially exactly being able to create it from your perspective first. Here's the offer I want to create, right? Because of, like you say, coming back down to their mission and to what actually lights them up and all those kinds of things. So you don't get sucked into building a business that you don't even like just because that's what everyone else seems to be doing. Exactly. And doing that aspect first, and then being like, okay, well, this offer is perfect for someone who is struggling with X, someone who is incompetent in this area. And then diving into that and then pulling out and creating that ideal client avatar essentially for that. And I really like that, because I think you're right. And I speak about that a lot, of balancing, the need and the importance of the ideal client with actually you as the business owner and as the creator of that business, because there needs to be the balance. It can't be one more than the other. It has to be both.
Exactly. And if you don't have like that full understanding of like the client's experience from their perspective of it not being their zone of genius, like them being totally lost in it, then they won't identify with what you sell, because you'll potentially just be talking about yourself and your genius over and over again. And they won't understand because that's not their genius.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. And how would you say, because I think that a lot of people sort of struggle actually, and it's like what you said at the beginning, that your zone of genius isn't necessarily the thing that you have spent years and years studying or learning or gaining experience in. And so what would you say to someone who is struggling to actually identify what their zone of genius is, or struggling to sort of identify if they're currently operating more in that zone of excellence than zone of genius? Like, what to you would be the hallmarks of zone of genius?
Yeah, there's actually two great like at-home things that you can do to try to like tap into what that means for you. So the first thing I always tell, the absolute first thing, and sometimes this is different with those bigger personalities, right? Because one week they might be tapping into one form of genius and the other week it might be something different. But this is going to directly relate to those people at home who are like, I'm building a business and it's fumbling or it's struggling or doesn't feel like totally connected to purpose, which is honestly a fundamental part of making something work. I would say to you, if you were going to sit down like right now at your computer or at a piece of paper and you were going to write a book, a 10-page book, what would you write it on? Immediately, what would you write it on? Would it be about a life experience? Would it be about something you know how to do that other people don't? Would it be about a topic that you happen to be so passionate about and don't remember even where that began? Like you just have always been passionate about it, right? So it's, what is that thing you can talk about for hours? You just have a wealth of advice and input and information to be able to divulge into it. And maybe you don't even have training on it, and that's okay, right? Because you don't have to have some long, history of education around your zone of genius. It could be something you're just born with. I have helped people where their intuition around people's gifts and stuff like that was just a natural ability, or someone just had the natural ability to see a budget and know how it's supposed to go for someone to make, optimize their money per month, right? So those kind of skill sets sometimes are just born into us. So write down, pretend like you're going to sit down at a book and just start writing, and what comes out, right? And oftentimes I even tell people to just do that. Just sit down at a blank piece of paper and start writing, and free write for sometimes 10 to 20 minutes, and go back and look at what you've written and find similarities in it. Find the commonalities that you've been pouring out of yourself, and start to hone in on those, because there's probably some really good information in that. And then the other thing that I always have people do is, if they're transitioning out of like the corporate environment, typically they don't even think about this, but your resume is oftentimes a wealth of insight into who you are. A lot of times the skills that we're most proud of are actually skills we've always had, our whole adult life. We've probably always had those skills. Like, I'm very detail oriented. I've been that way since I was just a little wee kid, right? Like, I've always been so detail oriented. That's a genius level for me. Like, I believe that the way I look at things and the way I look at details is different than other people. So that's a piece of genius I bring to my business. So look at your resume, look at your skills, look at what you've spent time educating yourself on, and circle them, right? Circle all the ones you think you love. And then out of those, put little hearts next to the ones you think you could sit and write a book about.
That's such a good idea. That's such a good idea. I love that idea of like, just, pulling out and actually think. Because I remember that when you were doing your masterclass, and I'm listening to them because I'm there, and I was thinking, like, trying to pull out, and you're so right that it's actually really interesting how sometimes you think zone of genius has to be almost like almost like a sort of umbrella topic. Like, zone of genius has to be, let's say marketing, right? And I don't really think that that's necessarily true. I think it's more, and I think that's what you were sort of saying here and before, that your zone of genius is more, like a sort of personality trait almost. It's almost like a facet of your personality, something that comes naturally to you, that then can almost be put within a context that you happen to maybe be very passionate about, you know? Because for me, I think one of my biggest zones of genius is probably problem solving. And because I love problem solving, and I'm just really good at it. And then you kind of think to yourself, okay, how can you build a business out of problem solving? But actually it's like, but you take that personality trait that you're naturally really good at, you put it within the context of something you're really passionate about. Okay, so for example, here, marketing, messaging, copywriting. And that's when you're able to be like, okay, here's how you could then sit and write a book about these three things, because I definitely could. I mean, here we are on this podcast where I just talk all the time about these things. But exactly. So I love that. And I think that idea and that exercise of identifying those traits that you have, those skills that you have and that you've always had, and then thinking about which ones could you sit and write a book about, or which ones, especially within the context of those things that you're passionate about and the industry that you love working in, and then, like you say, what ones could you write a book about? What ones could you, do a TED talk on, for example? Exactly. I love that. I think that's really great. And I think that's such a useful explanation of zone of genius, and actually how to dig into it and start leveraging it, rather than, because sometimes it can just be this too high level chatting about zone of genius, and it sort of just, it kind of misses the mark a bit. Whereas I think that how you explain it and how you dive into it with people is so much more tangible and useful. So I love it. So that's so useful. And when it comes to, as well, I guess, for especially like selling your zone of genius, are you simply talking about being able to pinpoint what that is so that you can create an offer that is really unique and designed exactly for one type of person who has that specific zone of incompetence, or are there other elements involved when it comes to selling your zone of genius?
Yeah. I think when you're building the framework that your client's going to experience. So here you are, the zone of genius in your field. And again, that zone of genius could be a skill set that other people have, but they're not looking at it through the lens of you, right? So you're looking at that skill through the sunglasses of you. and you're creating that framework for the client who doesn't have any of that. So you then have to take those lenses off and say, okay, I'm not me now, I'm my client. And they're looking at for my zone of genius because they're the exact opposite. So a lot of things that happen within that, and not just building the online, presence of the framework and the client experience, but it's that selling process, right? So when you do get the opportunity to speak to someone, maybe it's at a dinner party, or maybe it's, a friend of a friend that reaches out to you to hire you or to see if you're the good fit for them. A lot of people get kind of overwhelmed with that idea of then selling themselves, right? And the problem is they're selling themselves. They're not selling to that client's zone of incompetence. So I always tell everyone whenever we build out their framework, part of that is building out a script, something they know they can refer back to. And it doesn't have to be, people hear the word script and they're like, oh my God, I just cannot work like that, right? They're like, I cannot sit and read from a script. And that's not entirely what I mean. It's more so a script in the sense where you yourself have, 6 bullet points that you're going to help identify in the pain point of that person who has that zone of incompetence, who is desperately looking for the genius to help fill that space in their life and business, or in just their life in general. It doesn't matter what it is you're doing, it's in their life. So it's having the ability to have that script, and that sets you up as the gatekeeper to your genius that solves their problem. So when you have that, you have the ability to take them through a pain funnel, like being prepared to dig in and find those gaps in their life that your genius fills. And a mistake a lot of people make is they just want to sell to everybody. And typically they won't close anybody because they're not tapping into the reason that client is in pain, and the reason that they saw them and said, oh, I want to reach out. I want to learn more. I want to know more. People will explain their genius in a way that the words don't translate to somebody who doesn't have that genius. And that's where you come in. But, in general, that's a huge problem. They don't have that script and they're not tipping the scale. So a lot of times in that sales process, when you're trying to sell your zone of genius, sometimes it can feel weird, especially if your zone of genius is not something the everyday person is looking for. And that's good. And you talk about that, right? Like niching down to find your perfect person. But if you don't tip the scale, like if you have a scale in front of you and one side is money for the client and the other side is the pain pleasure factor, like you've got to tip that scale to where money doesn't matter anymore to them. And especially if you're charging high ticket and you want to be making what you deserve in your zone of genius, because we all deserve to be making exactly what we want for that level of genius we have. So if you're not tipping the scale for them, it's going to be really hard for them to understand why they need it. And all that plays into your framework and your messaging and the sales process itself, showing them you're going to get them over that hurdle, but doing it in a way that you're identifying that pain because they don't have the answers, but you do. And so you're helping solve that pain, right? So that's like a huge piece of it that people forget is they build everything around themselves, even their own script and even their own qualification process, even their own consulting process. It's all built around, hey, look at me and look what I can do for you. But if the client doesn't understand, it's never gonna connect for them.
Exactly. And it's all about with that and exactly, and this is how the messaging, the communication comes into play, coffee as well, whatever. It's translating all of that.
Yeah.
That's essentially what you're doing, right? It's translating all of that into words and taglines, cool things, whatever, that your ideal client will not only understand, but resonate with, connect with. And importantly for that tipping, will make them feel something. I mean, that's probably the most important thing that I say to people.
Mm-hmm.
And like with your messaging and all of your marketing, storytelling, like why does storytelling work? Because it makes you feel something. That's what you have to be doing with your messaging and with your marketing, because you have to be making people want to work with you, even, and like you say, forget about the money, forget about the investment, forget about the risk that their brain is flashing like a red alarm in their brain, like this feels risky, let's abandon this, when it's not, because of course that's what our brains are hardwired to do. And it's making, but it's tipping that in the way that makes them realize, there's a way out of that pain that you're in, that you can't just be touching on it, surface level. You have to go deep. And exactly, you're right. People don't, and it's from both sides. So it's like from with what you're talking about with the zone of genius and actually creating that offer. And then with the messaging as well, it's that detail and that specificity. I'm so bad at saying that word. I can never say that word properly. But that being so specific about who it is they're actually intending this thing for is so key. And I meet people who, you sort of say, so who's your ideal client? Like who's your target audience with this, with your business, with your brand as a whole? And it's just like, oh yeah, I know who they are. Like they're this, and it's just like a really, really basic level of information. And that's not going to do anything for anybody. So just like with creating and with selling, it's the same thing.
Exactly. And it's so interesting because, they build the offer and they hopefully hire someone like you to help with the messaging and all that key stuff that brings them in. But then when they get on those sales calls, they don't bring it back to like, they immediately take the place because, and this is understandable. We've all done it. I've definitely done it. We go into a place of wanting to convince the person in front of us or on the phone that we are the best match for them. But we do it in a way where we're talking about mostly ourselves and our genius, but we're not tapping into their incompetence, right? So it's like, if you do all this great stuff, but you don't close the consult, like you don't close that interaction with them by actually still remaining in the integrity of the copy you've written that talks to them, then that whole everything you've just done kind of flies out the window. And you're like, wait, I am the genius. I promise. Don't go. Right. And there they are leaving because they're like, well, she's a genius, but I don't think that it's too much for me. That I don't think she understands where I'm at, Yes.
And that being able to show, we speak about a lot, like showing, empathy through the messaging, through the copy, which is important for building that know, like, and trust. But exactly, in this respect, it's also important just to show somebody that, I understand what it is you're looking for and I can help you with that. I understand where you're trying to go, what it is you're actually struggling with. Not just I understand how you feel about it all, but I actually tangibly understand, because there's nothing worse than, it's like, for example, if you think about whenever you have, a conversation about your business with maybe a friend or a family member who doesn't quite get what it is you do or what it is that you're trying to do. And there's always that there's that disconnect, right? Because it doesn't matter how many times you try to explain it, like they just don't get it. And so you therefore might get to the stage, I know I get to this stage with certain people, where I think that even when I'm struggling with a problem and I just want to talk it out with someone, I just, sometimes just want to vent, just want to sort of think out loud to someone, you stop yourself because you kind of think, but they don't get it, so there's no point. And then you find yourself looking for someone who gets it. As simple as that. Looking for someone who understands, who can listen, who gets what you're trying to say, and then can perhaps offer some advice. I think a lot of the time, when people are hiring coaches and consultants and stuff, I think a lot of the time people are looking for a sounding board. They're looking for somebody who is not necessarily teach me every single little thing it's listen to me, give me some advice that's actually useful and help me feel supported.
Exactly.
I always feel like that's one of the biggest things. We're going to go off track really easily. my fault because I just get stuck. Like we just end up, and I said at the beginning, we have to keep this on track because it's my fault. I just want to chat about all these things with you. It's really difficult. What can I say?
I agree.
Yeah, I know. But for the episode, for the purposes of keeping this episode on track, give me, and let's start wrapping this up. Give me your top 3 tips for listeners who are wanting to create a really standout offer that they can actually scale with, that they can really take far.
Yeah, that's powerful. I would say tip number 1, for sure, understand your client's pain. Understand it to the deepest levels you could possibly imagine and write it out. Write out every single thing that you think they're struggling with that you help with and figure out how it ties in. Because if you don't actually map that out and you're just thinking about it, oh, I do this, great, it's going to be really hard to tie it back. So I highly suggest getting a bunch of paper and just writing as much as you can about that specific topic. Tip number 2, stop trying to make everybody your client, right? It's a bad perfume that nobody wants. You know, it's like you're walking through the store and people are trying to spray you. Oh, this is the best. You're like, I don't want that. It stinks. Yeah. That's what happens when you're telling everybody how amazing you are at this one thing. And when you stop doing that and you start talking to them about what they're not amazing at and how it sucks and how it's really hard and you can help them, they'll start listening. So stop trying to make every single person your client and just talk to that one person that's actually struggling. And be okay with having a consult, even when you're just starting. And when it's not a good fit, say no. Like there's so much power in that. It's not even funny. And then I think tip number 3 is like a combination, really. It's absolutely make sure that this is your zone of genius, but also make sure that that zone of genius is truly within your like joy center. Because sometimes we have a skill set that is totally monetizable, but doesn't bring us joy. And that's a really big thing you should stay away from. And the bonus part of tip 3 is when you follow your joy, it's going to be a lot easier to help those individuals realize that you're more valuable than them keeping their money in their bank account, right? Like if you're more valuable than them keeping it where it is, they know the value of you and they're going to spend it on you.
I love that. And I especially love the idea of following your joy, because I think that that's so important and it's often not focused on enough. You know, it's what can I monetize? Why don't you do this sort of thing? Again, you know, I find like a lot of well-intentioned family members feel like because I own a business, I'm just going to chuck every random business idea at you. Why don't you do this too? Why don't you do this too? And I'm always like, yeah, sure. I mean, you can do that, because it's like they don't seem to get that I have no interest in doing that. Why would I do that? And it's almost like, oh, because you have a business, why wouldn't you just want this other idea that could potentially make you money? I'm definitely not the sort of person who can do something just because it can make me money. Like I need to have that joy. Yeah, that's it. And I think that's a lovely thing, because I think that it's so important, because I think when it comes down to, you know, the messaging, most of the time when I ever have consults, one of the things that I ask is, you know, what's your why? What's your mission with this? Because that's so important for the messaging, for the marketing. I honestly believe that if you're not following that joy and following that passion, and really there is something that you could just talk about for hours, you think it's so important, it's so necessary, I really think you're always going to have a hard time effectively marketing your business and therefore scaling it. You know, so it's so important to realize that as well. Which brings us back around nicely to why it's so important to make sure that the offers that you're creating are actually coming from that zone of genius. Because it's that thing that is naturally, you know, you're naturally good at, and you're usually doing it within an industry or an area of an industry that you're highly passionate about.
Exactly.
So I love that. And I know that you've mentioned that you have like a high-end offer workbook that people can download?
Yeah, I do. So on the homepage of my website, I actually do have it's totally free, which people keep telling me is crazy. Apparently, it adds a lot of value. So it's a workbook. You literally just put in your name and email and it populates and you immediately can download it. And it literally covers everything you need to know about building a high-end offer.
Mm-hmm. That sounds amazing. And
Yeah.
so what is your website?
That would be a good thing to add. So my website is melavacreative.com. So MELAVA creative.com.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for coming on, taking the time to chat with us about your zone of genius, selling your zone of genius, and all the little nuggets of gold that you have just dropped down in this episode. It's been so nice chatting with you, and
it's so great.
It's just been so great. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you so much for having me. You're brilliant, so brilliant. So this was great. I really had a good time, and hopefully people will get a lot out of it.
I think they will. They will. I'll talk to you soon.
Thank you.